Well, good morning, and thank you for your interest in this session. It is my pleasure to be your moderator today. My name is Michael Werz, and we will talk about an issue that for many years in the Cold War era might have been seen as a soft policy issue. And in a world in disorder, in a world that is structured in a very different manner than only 20 years ago, we now understand that multilateralism is I don't want to say our last hope, but one of the key pillars of how the world will look 10 or 20 or even 25 years from now. So I'm grateful that we have a panel of experts and strong voices in the arena that will speak to the issue of reinventing multilateral governance, and I would assume that that also means reforming and dramatically changing multilateral governance, because many of the organizations and institutions that we will speak about are still either products of the Cold War, or they are finding themselves in a transition or in an evolution, if you look at the World Bank, to reconnect with new demands in a new era. So I'm very glad that we will have an opening input by Maria João Rodrigues, who is the president of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, a good friend of the Progressive Center here in Berlin, and also a frequent visitor to the United States, where I work at the Center for American Progress. So Maria, it's great to see you again. And your organization has recently published a book on the issue, specifically looking at the SDGs, and I assume conveying a sense of urgency, because as of last fall, only 15% of the SDGs in the 2030 Agenda, the big reform agenda with regard to climate and development, have been on track. We are lagging behind the standards that the international community has set for itself. How do we deal with these issues? Give us a little bit of an overview of how you see this process playing out and how we can re-energize conversations like this one we are having here today in Berlin.
Yeah. Well, many thanks for the question. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be all the colleagues in the panel. Let me start with 2 or 3 questions. One, in fact, is about war. Is it possible for Ukraine to win the war and contain Putin's aggression if we don't have large alliances across the world? Another question. AI emerging as a big tech power, changing everything in our lives. But this is happening without proper rules. Can we go on like that? Second question. Another question about, in fact, climate emergency. Is it possible to tackle climate emergency without tackling at the same time social inequalities inside countries and between countries? No, this is not possible. So these are questions we progressives we need to raise, and global governance must be a central part of our progressive agenda. Now, we have a crisis of global governance, let's face it. And we have a very weak, outdated multilateral system in a multipolar world. So there is a big task ahead, which is really to update this multilateral system in such a way this becomes more inclusive, more democratic, more effective. And this is why, in fact, we in FEPS we have conducted a sequence of projects under the label United for, because we are bringing new ideas to the General Assembly of the multilateral system in New York each September. So this time around, we have prepared, in fact, this book. You can find some copies outside. And the main idea is the following. We do have an opportunity now coming. And the opportunity is created by something happening in next September in New York, is the Summit of the Future, where some key decisions of reform and global governance should be taken. And basically, the summit will adopt a pact for the future. So the question is, what should be our proposals for this pact for the future? And we think that a new global deal is necessary. A new global deal making sure that we have the means to provide new public goods, tackling climate change, governing AI as examples. We should focus on youth and future generations to have really a planet with life chances for them. And we need also to recognize that something is wrong in the relationship between developing countries and developed countries. Because if we ask, if a country really wants to implement SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, are we sure this developing country has the means to do so? We are not sure at all, because they miss the technology, they miss the financial means, and they miss the trade opportunities. So the purpose of the new global deal is about this.
Thank you very much. And let me follow this up with one very brief question. You have laid out an ambitious agenda. You have also mentioned that there's a discrepancy of how, for the sake of a better description, countries of the global north and the global south look at the world. We've seen this play out in a very intense manner when it came to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, where countries representing more than half of the world were not willing to follow UN resolutions that were pushed by the United States and Europe. How do you see this playing out? Asking you for a brief answer for a very complex question. How do these multilateral organizations and institutions that have been formed during the Cold War and mostly shaped by countries in the global north, how do they gain legitimacy, buy-in, and the full support for that reform agenda that you have just spelled out by countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia?
Well, I think this is quite simple. These countries, so developing countries, they argue, well, the war in Ukraine is not our main problem. So don't count on us too much to help you about this, because we have much more urgent problems. So what should we do? We should, of course, we need to support Ukraine with all the means we can mobilize, but at the same time, we need to broad alliances across the world by listening to their problems and coming with the possible answers to their problems, starting with social inequalities, poverty, while tackling climate change. Because for many countries in developing, they say, well, yes, climate change is there, but we want to industrialize because we need to create jobs, we need to tackle social inequalities. So if you want us to industrialize in another way, let's work together. We have a lot of technological solutions to bring about together. So the new global deal we are calling for with this book is exactly about a higher cooperation regarding technology, regarding trade opportunities, and regarding finance. Because I can tell you, at the end of the day, we need to reform the taxation system. And let me just give an example. We had a proposal coming from developing countries in the United Nations to have a United Nations tax reform. But for the time being, this was not supported by some Western countries.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Let me turn it over to Diego Martínez Belío, who is the State Secretary for Foreign and Global Affairs of the government of Spain. Thank you so much for making time to join us here. I'd like to ask you to comment on what Maria has just said, and also maybe weave in a response to the follow-up question that I have asked her. Spain is very exposed to Africa, as is Italy. It is a country that is heavily engaged, especially in Mediterranean affairs. So I assume that questions of the notion that the international order has not been built for countries in Africa is part of your daily bread. And I'd like to have you comment on that briefly, if you may.
Of course. So first of all, good morning, everyone, and congratulations for the book. I was reading it on the plane, and I think it's very thorough and has many interesting proposals. Just first, briefly on the general question, and I think there's, if you read our common agenda or the Pact for the Future in its current version, what's striking is how much it fits with the progressive agenda. So in fact, it's almost like a blueprint also for internal policies. So the objectives are reducing inequality, poverty, women and women empowerment, etc. So that fits in with what we want to do internally as well. And so the difference, I think, is the tools. We have the state has all the policy tools, and the world order has no policy tools except those provided by states. So we have at the highest level, the European Union, with real policy tools which have a possibility to impact internally, and then we have the United Nations, which is the opposite, and it's based on consensus. So that's very different, and this is a fact of international life and organization that has been going on for 100 years since the League of Nations, but what has changed is international society. So now we have global challenges, some of them existential, like global climate change. We have AI, you mentioned it, and this is something that is, if it's developed competitively, can have very good effects. But if it's developing competition between great powers, it can have very dire effects on the economy, and even worse effects, which I prefer not to mention. And there are now 200 states instead of a handful, like it was at the time of the League of Nations. So things have changed a lot, and the basics of the international system remain the same. And then, to top it all, we have aggressive tendencies everywhere, nationalist tendencies, which make international cooperation. I mean, there's a backlash against international cooperation in and of itself, regardless of the objectives. And the aggression against Ukraine is the most blatant case, but I think this is part of a trend. So concerning the South or African countries, most of them are not in the South, in fact, but we have this expression of Global South, which doesn't mean anything, in fact. So I would say there's an accusation of double standards, that's certain, and to say that the system is rigged and doesn't work for them. But there is also an expectation from us, and when I mean us, I mean we're in Europe, so I mean Europe, perhaps other countries, that we live up to the what our discourse and our principles. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say it's not a rejection, but sometimes there's some modicum of rejection, and then there's perhaps also some disappointment. So disappointment is easier to overcome than rejection. So that's positive. And I think we need to listen to what they're saying. Concerning Ukraine, by the way, the resolutions were passed with 143 votes. So that's the vast majority of states, including those in Africa and Latin America, and we did some outreach on Africa and Latin America as well. So I think we can work together, and what's striking is that when you see the Pact for the Future, it includes all those principles, and all those principles are accepted by most states. In fact, apparently all of the states which are taking part in negotiations, which are almost every state. So there's no ideological rejection. In a way, it might be in the internal speech, but most of the time the rejection of the UN Charter is based on special cases, like Ukraine, in fact, is not a real country, but we are not saying that countries should not be sovereign, or we have rights on some territory because of historic rights. Mm-hmm. But no one is saying we are against sovereignty, we are against non-interference in internal affairs, etc. So that's another basis which we can work upon. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. I'll come back to this later, and I'll try to challenge you a little bit on this, because just having come from a 2-day conference on exactly these issues with a lot of representatives from what we would call global swing states like South Africa, mm-hmm. India, and Brazil, the narrative is very, very convincing, and also very much not in line with the strong normative approach that we like to pursue in the Western countries. And I'd like to drill a little bit deeper into this. But let me turn it over to Ann Linde, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Sweden. You have set a very progressive agenda. Your time on democracy, on gender, on climate and security. Would like to ask you to talk a little bit about how that connected with the global governance reforms that we are talking about now, and also how we deal with maintaining the speed that we need at the multilateral level if there are changes in government, like in your country and in other countries, where governments come into power whose priority is not the reform of the multilateral system, but in some cases the exact opposite.
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to say that our progressive security agenda is actually different from the conservative and the right wings. And you can see it very clearly. Let me just take 4 points where we have another agenda than the conservative and the right wings. And I will go quickly into each, but first the 4. First, gender issues. And we haven't mentioned it here either for 1.5 days already. But you should remember what Pistorius said yesterday, the defense minister of Germany, that progressive security is not just military, it's everything around that creates security and a safe environment. And number 1 here, I would say, is the question of gender. And this is also in this book. I also have it. We have now lobbying for this book, so please read it. There are actually in the first chapter, just to remind you, it will take 140 years for women to be represented in position of power in workplaces. It would take 40 years to achieve equality in national parliament. It will take 296 years for close gaps in legal protection. And we know when it comes to security that if women are in peace agreement, they last 20% longer if there is women in the negotiating team, and they will be 35 years longer if it's 15 years or longer for the peace to reach. And still, how many women do you think have been in the negotiating teams over the years? Well, you can think about that, and I will give you the answer, because the answer is 15% of peace negotiators between 1992 and 2019. And still there are hundreds, literally hundreds of research reports about this. So women and peace and security is interlinked. We are now doing a big project between FEPS and Friedrich-Ebert Foundation on the Feminist Foreign Policy, Progressive Voices Collective. Julia is there, you can ask her more about it. And the first policy brief out of 7 that we are doing is to use foresight. And those of you who work, like I've done my whole life in security policy and defense, knows that if you don't do foresight reports, you are not prepared for what's coming. And that's both military, but it's also civilian, like COVID, like environmental disaster. But there is no gender perspective. So now we will publish soon a policy brief on how to get feminism into foresights. And we have recommendation, is Anastasia Montesir. She is a feminist researcher who has written it. It's very academic in the beginning, but the recommendation on how we should deal with this are very clear. So I hope you will read it. The 3 other things. Democracy. I mean, the democracy for the 6th years in a row, it's going backwards. It's not going forwards anymore. It's going backwards. And actually, there is now more countries going in authoritarian style than going in a democratic style. And when economists did democracy ranking on all those countries that are having election this year, they show that it's only full and free election in 43 countries out of the 76 that is doing election this year. 27 of those were from EU. And actually, it's today 71% of the world's population lives in an authoritarian state. 10 years ago, it was only 48%. I mean, could you believe it? I cannot believe it. And we don't have a multilateral system who take this up. On the other hand, instead of being inclusive, to get more democracy, to get NGOs, to get civil society, to get minority groups, it's going backwards, the other way. United Nations is actually getting less civil society inclusivity, and also all those right-wing government is cutting down on funding for NGOs. This is totally against a democratic multilateral way, and we need to change it. And hopefully, both in this book, but also in the high-level advisory board that was Guterres was setting up with my former Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, and Liberia's former President, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson. They have a lot of ideas, both on how to get more inclusivity, and they also said, if we should do anything at all, we should start by SDG 5 on gender. And they have concrete proposal to use in the SOFA. Disarmament, climate and security, we can go back to that. I think that the work on disarmament is catastrophically low. You know, now all those agreements that were before with Russia and or Soviet Union and Russia and America are gone. They are not there anymore. NPT is being weaker. That's non-proliferation treaty that UN is overseeing. We, Sweden and Germany, were leading project called the Stockholm Initiative with 22 concrete stepping stones for NPT in UN to have more disarmament in the world. Finally, the climate and security. Everybody now recognizes that there is a link between climate and security. It's scarcity of resources, it's food security, it's water. Even when you go to Nagorno-Karabakh and discuss with Armenia and Azerbaijan, they are discussing water. In Africa now, everybody knows that the water issues of the big Renaissance Dam and everything is there. All those, I can say, example, all those 4 issues is part of a progressive security agenda. And you know what happened in Sweden when we left after 8 years in government, and the right wing supported by the extreme right? They stopped all 4. The first decision the right wing foreign minister took was to abolish feminist foreign policy. Then they abolish the ambassador that I have appointed for security and climate. Then they cut the funding for both IDEA, you know, international, into half, and the civil society funding. And then they said that disarmament is not as important anymore when it comes to people who work in the foreign ministry. So it's really difference between progressive and right-wing. And we should remember this when we want to make a new multilateral order.
Thank you very much, Ann. Neva, Grašič, let me turn it over to you. You're the deputy head of the office of the Vice President of Slovenia. Your country is a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, so you have the opportunity to explain to all of us how we solve, or you rather, solve all these issues. More seriously, it is absolutely clear that the Security Council needs reform. It is also fairly clear that that reform is very unlikely to happen. It is not representative. It is a product, again, of the Cold War, and the veto powers were the powers that, when the council was set up, had nuclear weapons at their disposal because they needed to have a veto, so they would not have to use those weapons. That was the logic way back when. So how do you see that reform conversation playing out that we have just been talking about? And give us a little bit of a flavor of where you see your government advancing the agenda.
Thank you, Michael, and it's a pleasure to be here. Anne kind of warmed my heart with her intervention, and I am hoping that we could go back to the gender issues as well. I think as Spain, Sweden, at least in the previous government, and Slovenia are all running feminist foreign policy, I think we have a good batch to discuss on this later on. But it would be a shame if we didn't talk about the Security Council, as Slovenia is a non-permanent member of the Security Council now in this mandate 2024-2025. I think we ran quite a independent campaign based on dialogue. We try to have a dialogue with all of the partners, especially with the Global South. It's a shame that nobody represents here the Global South, but I think Diego and I, maybe Latin America and maybe with focus on Africa, can say a few words about this as well. Slovenia, as a small country, is trying to be an honest broker and a credible and consistent partner in the Security Council. And our slogan of the campaign was building trust, securing future. And I think it could be a slogan of the Reform United Nations as well, because these are the issues that we should talk about. For us, as a small state, I think the strong set of international rules is a basis and of crucial importance for our work. To have a secure, stable, and predictable international order is something that we strive for as it's the core of our existence in the international community, but it's slipping away from us, unfortunately. And we have to keep in mind that the majority of the international community are small states, and the two-thirds majority in the United Nations are developing countries. So we should adapt the work of the United Nations to this as well. What we talked yesterday already, that the challenges that we are facing today definitely require a strong set of rules-based system, a very inclusive multilateral system with the United Nations at its core. And despite all the shortcomings that we are talking about here today and all the existing divisions that we see among the states, it is a system that is still as indispensable today as ever. And we do need to do more as progressives to make it more effective, more inclusive, and to make United Nations fit to face the current challenges. When we talk about the reform of the United Nations, of course, we should touch upon the reform of the Security Council. It absolutely seems that in the current geopolitical context, there is a loss of faith that the Security Council has any ability to secure or effectively prevent any kind of conflict that is going on now. It is becoming increasingly challenging to find any agreement among the P5. And even the General Assembly took over, the initiatives when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, when it comes to Middle East, and so on. And it's impacting the work and the proceeding of the Security Council for sure. But it's the fact that it remains the most important piece of the multilateral architecture. But that's why we need to reform it to become better reflection of the diversity of the General Assembly, for sure. To have a better equal representation of all the regions, Africa included, to have a balanced expansion of the permanent and non-permanent members as much as possible. When it comes to veto, I think the abuse of veto has paralyzed the Security Council as we see it now, and we are very much supporting the veto should be limited, especially when it comes to mass atrocities. There is a proposal many years ago already by the French and Mexican proposal on the political declaration of suspension of veto powers in causes of mass atrocities. It's been on the table for many years. Slovenia is part of a group of 27 states that is led by Switzerland. It's called the ACT group that is working on much more accountability and transparency inside the Security Council. We have the Liechtenstein initiative that every time a veto is used, that there should be directly a debate in the General Assembly and so on. So the propositions are on the table, and we'll see if there is some hope to achieve that. But also one Anne has said about the new threats to the security. I think the Security Council is not yet equipped to address the new threats to the international peace and security when it comes to climate change, when it comes to environment degradation, when it comes to water and food security, and when it comes to health crisis and so on. And these are now the crisis or the threats they have significant impact on the security of the nations and on the global stability. I don't have much hope for the reform as well. But you know, yesterday even Olaf Scholz talked about hope, so let's keep it somewhere there.
Okay.
For the first intervention.
Thank you for that blunt assessment. Maria, let me take up what we've just heard. So the UN Security Council reform, difficult and unlikely. Does it make sense to focus a lot of political energy on pushing the reform of an obviously unreformable institution, or should progressive organizations focus on looking at UN agencies that are doing good work, like UNDP, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Food Programme, and focus on reform of agencies within the UN galaxy that are stronger when it comes to implementation, that are at least in part less politicized than the UN Security Council, and basically try an institutional reform agenda that doesn't start at the top, because that agenda has been stuck for at least 15, maybe 20 years. Is it time for creative thinking in the UN world?
Yeah. Look, this is, I think, a central question of global politics. So, and we progressives should have a global strategy for global politics. From my viewpoint, the situation created by the war in Ukraine and also the Middle East has poisoned the landscape so much that I'm not confident that we can find a solution up to the Summit of the Future in September. We need to put our pieces in such a way that in another moment the situation will be better. But in the meantime, we have acute global challenges. The climate, AI out of control, just to give some examples. So I do hope that the Summit of the Future takes meaningful decisions about this. And by the way, this will be followed by other summits on social development, on finance, in the hands of the Spanish government. So we have a full process designed somehow by Guterres to really push for a progressive agenda in spite of these difficult bottlenecks created by the conflicts, major conflicts. But let me just give an example about global politics. Last summer, we had a sequence which is about to be repeated this summer, starting with the summit of G7, followed by the summit of the BRICS. You remember last time it was in South Africa. This time will be chaired by Putin. So pay attention to the summit of the BRICS chaired by Putin. And the risk we have is this opposition between G7, meaning the West, and then the BRICS trying to become the representatives of the rest. This is a very dangerous game. We need to prevent this game to happen. This is dangerous for humankind, for the planet. Well, I can tell you, coming back to the example of last summer, the tension was very high by the end of August because of this. So G7, the West, and then the rest represented by the BRICS. We cannot let this happen. And what has reduced the tension last summer was a G20 summit conducted by India, I must say, in a quite effective way. This has reduced the tension, and this has allowed United Nations Summit on Sustainable Development Goals to adopt a common declaration in September. This summer we'll have a similar game. And now there is a very interesting novelty, is that G20 is being chaired by Brazil. It would be great to have someone here representing Brazil, because Brazil has a progressive agenda in their hands, ambitious one, not easy, but they can be a very important player, also because they are preparing the COP. So let's, as progressives, work a larger coalition of forces across the world. So this is my advice.
Thank you. Let me take this up and get back to you as the virtual representative of the Global South.
Heavy burden.
A heavy burden, but also great opportunities there. My apologies for putting you on the point here. Maria has just pointed out the potential that the G20 has in Rio. Obviously, massive agenda for the Brazilians, positioning the country in the global arena, possibly for the first time at that level. Very ambitious, outcome-oriented summit. At the same time, President Lula has invited Vladimir Putin to attend the summit. President Lula has also been reminded by a number of Brazilian judges that they might execute the international red notice, but at the same time, it was a clear signal that the Lula administration has sent even before. For example, when they let Iranian warships anchor in Sao Paulo, that they are not going to subscribe to what people on this panel would argue is the normative democratic environment within we would like to see global governance play out. I mentioned to you that I just came from a conversation about the Ukraine issues and global governance issues, especially with representatives from Africa. In a slightly simplified manner, the argument was, you guys in Europe have conservatives up in arms. You're losing massive chunks of your population to right-wing and neo-fascist movements. You need to invest in your welfare states and in your infrastructure. Why are you spending so much money on Ukraine? We know Putin is not sympathetic, but everybody in the world is a hypocrite. And why do you insist that the norms of the post-Cold War order are so much more important that you run the risk of undermining democracy in your own countries and damaging yourselves long term? Admittedly, that is a little bit of a shorthand, and the conversation was much more differentiated than that. But I thought the bottom line of this argument is something where we need to find an answer to.
Yes, what I was saying before is not that there's contestation, but this is let's say, a practical case. But they're not contesting the principles. They're not saying Ukraine has no sovereignty. They're saying there are other cases where we have similar cases of undermining the UN Charter, and you haven't reacted in the same way.
Yes.
So it goes more to a double standards accusation, and on our economies, etc. Well, they can take care of their economies. We'll take care of ours. That's not. I mean, I will go more to the criticism on the global attitudes, and they may have a point on that. So, but what I was saying before is that this is not an ideological critique. It doesn't go to the concrete point. It goes to an application of that point. So they are not contesting the UN Charter. They're not contesting the International Pact on Human Rights. Even revisionist, quote-unquote, countries are not contesting that. They're saying that they're applying in a hypocritical way. And they may have a point on that. I'm not saying on a specific case of Ukraine, but in general. So that's I think that's different. And going to UN Security Council reform, you said, does it make sense to use lots of political capital? My personal opinion is no, it doesn't. I remember 15 years ago, I was a young advisor to the foreign minister then, and I asked him, but I mean, this is never going to happen. And he said, no, yes, it will happen, and I think it will happen soon. And it's been 15 years, and I went to G20 in Rio, in fact, to the foreign ministers' meeting, and I saw that it was back in the agenda. And I said, well, this is not going to work out this time either. And it's not going to work, I think, for two reasons. First, because the current permanent members don't want to lose power, and that's. But I think there's also another point: is that if you reform something to make it less workable, less functional, I mean, these are self-reinforcing arguments. If you give more countries veto, there will be more vetoes. So the council will work even less well. So that's why I think there's little chance for reform at the UN Security Council. I think there's makes much more sense to reform international financial institutions. We're holding the summit in 2025. That's almost mathematical. I mean, the Security Council reflects prestige, power, whatever, and that the international economic institutions, financial, should reflect economies, and that's almost mathematics. So I think that's a match, and there's one of the principles which applies as well. Countries who have an entrenched interest don't want to lose power, but then the other side, I mean, it will make it more functional. Yeah. So if you take, I mean, there's the argument that works against and the other works for. So there's much more chances of getting that done. And I also think that's more important and it will have more effects.
Thank you. I'd like to highlight one more issue, and I will ask Anna and Neva to comment on this, and after that we'll open it up for a conversation. So if you have questions or suggestions, please think about them, and I don't know if we have microphones in the room. If that is the case, please make sure that you signal the persons that will hand the microphone to you. And you've been, as a foreign minister, part of a lot of government-to-government negotiations, and I have question for you and for Neva that I think is really concerning. It was relatively clear during the last spring meetings of the World Bank Group in Washington that you have an emerging and not so clandestine competition for financial resources within the broader development era. There's the food security people that want resources. There's a climate security people that want and need resources for climate finance. There's the traditional development community, and obviously there is the health community. That competition for the first time has been much more outspoken because resources are shrinking. At the same time, we are investing more into defense and military spending. How do we initiate a broader conversation about ambitious development goals that your government has pushed in your time in times of fewer resources that are available? And how do we make sure that this becomes a unified development, climate, migration, and health conversation rather than one where different parts of the SDG agenda are being played out against each other?
Well, you're right on it that one of the big issues is the global financing and the global financing system. And unfortunately, it's going in the total wrong direction if you compare it what we want and what the right wing want. And I think the right thing to do is to insist that security is not only military means, but security, progressive security, is this much broader, taking into account issues of both migration and climate and food security and those issues. Otherwise, the military means will always win. And especially now because many European countries feel like they have been naive and didn't read the situation right when there was a massive disarmament after the Cold War ended. I heard Jens Stoltenberg who said that when he started 10 years ago, it was only 3 countries who reached the 2% goal of military spending. And now it's, I think, 23 or 24 hours. I don't know it exact, but something like that, out of the 32 countries. And at the same time, you can see that the development spending has gone down. And now you see one of the main countries that has nearly have the 1% goal, Netherlands. The new government has already said that they will drastically reduce their development spending. And you can see also that happens in Sweden, that they turn development spending into military spending because they want, like the leader of the Sweden Democrats, that's AFD in German terms. We would like all development aid, that is 1% of our BNI, to go to Ukraine. And they put Global South need of development in contrast to giving support to Ukraine. And of course, that is, it shouldn't be like that. And I think that the only way to stop this is that the ministers of defense and military establishment and so start to talk much more about what is security. It's much, much broader. We need also to finance these issues and not only military means.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point. That conversation, luckily, is happening, especially in the United States. It's fairly far advanced, but there is a connectivity that we need to define more clearly. I'd again ask you to signal me if you'd like to intervene before I give the last word in this first round to Neva with a slight variation of the question. Anne has argued that you need to make sure that there is enough resources for development, but she's also mentioned that we have kind of been fairly leisurely in consuming what we saw as the peace dividend after 1989. The economic estimates out there that this was about 1,500 billion euros that were not spent on traditional defense expenses, but were basically consumed by the European societies. Now the financial situation is much more scarce. How do you argue when you go home from a UN Security Council meeting to your hometown, when you try to convince people that your country and the European Union must invest more in SDGs, and people say, but this is really colliding with your progressive domestic policy agenda because these are competing interests? How do you solve that puzzle?
My hometown is Lashko, so they are more interested in beer than spending defense money, but it's a good practice for us politicians. Listen, I think the EU is fully aware that the success of the SDGs is dependent also on the capacity of how we can support this agenda in developing countries. These are the common challenges that are facing us that can only be addressed in the inclusive global governance. And EU is such a global actor, and Slovenia as a member state, of course, that it's able to influence this international game of pushing rules-based global governance and safeguarding the multilateral institutions. What we as a progressive have kind of fortunate that we have the leadership of Antonio Guterres as the Secretary General in the United Nations, and that his leadership on the our agenda, our common agenda, is significant and is paving the way for this kind of discussions that you mentioned, Michael, and the work he's doing on the Summit of the Future and also on the Social Summit in 2025. I think his leadership and also the questions that we as the progressives are asking us is, are we fully aware of the current situation and the trends that the international community has? Are we trying to respect the mutually agreed rules and the norms? At least from my point of view, are we trying to be humble and are we showing solidarity in this system? And are we embracing the future, having the political will to do the challenges and the changes? And what I would personally add, of course, are we the ones that are talking about equality and equal opportunities inside this system? If Anne has brought up some numbers, I would like to bring us some numbers as well.
Briefly, please.
I mean, if we're talking about security in the broader sense, of course, then we should talk about also security, equality and security in all of the aspects. If we're talking about the General Assembly, one of the initiatives that we are supporting and working together actually with the Spanish friends is to have initiative of rotating gender of the president of the General Assembly. I think this is something that I would like to see, in the discussion as well when it comes to talking about the progressive governance also inside the United Nations.
Thank you, Neva. We will invite you back after your non-permanent membership ends, and you can tell us the success story of how you have advanced that agenda. I will take two interventions right now. The first one is over here, the second one over here. Please let us know who you are. Please be brief and concise, and you're not allowed to address a question to all four speakers, because then we will have dinner here, and that is not the plan.
Well, I'll let you as chair pick who this goes to, but my name is Natalie Bennett. I'm one of the Green Party members of the UK House of Lords. And no one's mentioned civil society and the role in which we might have in enlisting civil society to work towards pressure, changing the multilateral institutions. I'm thinking of the example of Maginski-style sanctions, which is something that came entirely out of civil society campaigning. It's not yet on a multilateral stage, but it's happened in many places. And I'm also thinking of the campaign for the creation of the international offence of ecocide. Yet there's very little public, almost no, certainly UK public understanding about what's happening at the UN, what efforts are made to reform it. How do we get civil society involvement and engagement, and what might that achieve?
Thank you so much. I think I'll give this one to Maria, because she's the civil society representative, technically speaking here, and we'll take your second intervention as well.
Thank you very much. Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. My name is Alyssa Schmier from the United Nations University for Peace. And my question goes back to the lacking support for Ukraine in the Global South. And I think you were mentioning the UN resolution and how we will see that the majority of countries are condemning the actions in Russia, but at the same time, we do not have the same sort of support for the sanctions we're imposing on Russia. So I think that brings up a very interesting point. And you were mentioning already, well, maybe these the countries have their own problems, or there's this discussion about the double standard. But I want to add a little bit to that, another dimension to it. And I've been talking to a friend from Myanmar, and she was bringing up the point, but we've been calling up for the international community to help us within our conflicts as well. And I myself have been working in Cameroon, and I have witnessed exactly the same thing, that people are looking up to the international community and don't see them respond. And that brings me to my point, which is actually, I see a lack of credibility in the Global South that would rather not see the UN as a global institution, but a rather Western institution. And we've been talking about like institutional reforms that are very important, but I want to ask you about cultural reforms that UN might need. And maybe gender equality would be one. There is a general secretary missing, a female general secretary. We haven't seen that yet. So yeah, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Maria, the question to you with regard to NGO involvement and what roles NGOs can play. I mean, maybe the World Health Organization, the vaccination programs, the involvement of massive foundations like the Gate Foundations prepare something of a blueprint. I mean, there are examples of a multilateralism of the willing that has more substantially involved NGOs. And then I'd like to give the question with regard to the credibility of those institutions vis-a-vis the Global South, asking for brief response to Anne and to Diego.
Yeah.
Maria, you start.
Look, in fact, we are right now discussing a new paradigm for global governance, which should give a much stronger role to civil society stakeholders, and there are many, from NGOs, academia, the corporates, the trade unions, the social partners in general, the cultural organizations. Well, we have a full range of actors which have views about global governance, and already now they play a quite unique role. Anna was underlining this. We need to support this role. Well, this is not completely accepted. Sometimes we still have a traditional viewpoint according to which global governance, multilateralism, this is more about just governments. And even for parliamentarians, this is also not easy to bring the role of parliamentarians. But all this is under discussion exactly for the summit of the future. And some decisions should be taken there on giving a more organized and explicit role to civil society at all levels. At the top level, close to the General Assembly, close to ECOSOC, but also, as you are saying, close to the United Nations agencies and on concrete partnerships on the ground, because we see this is already the reality. When we have bad outcomes on providing solutions for food, water, climate, is because civil society is playing a very important role. Well, then we have the question you raised, the Western bias. You are right. Our United Nations system is a system of the 20th century, not of the 21st century. And there is a big push to change this. I must say that I was very pleased to see the first big United Nations civil society conference happening for the first time, not in New York, not in Europe, but in Africa. It was in Kenya some weeks ago. But this is my point. There we heard strong voice from African civil society. And their message, you can see even today, the demonstrations in the streets of Nairobi, when the government announced they will increase taxes because they want to pay their debt, external debt, extremely high. Almost half of the budget is to pay the debt. So you can understand the level of dramatic pressure they are in. And you have a full young generation in African countries saying, we don't want to have this life, paying for taxation to pay a debt with incredible high interest rates. And so I'm sorry because I need to say something about the financial issue. And I'm so pleased that the Spanish government is in charge of this. Because if we want to have a strong alliance with the developing countries, let's tackle the financial issue. This is the most important one. And this is about mobilizing large-scale, long-term investment capacity from private side, from public side. This is about making sure that the countries in need with a big shock, a big climate disaster, they can count on what is called special drawing rights of IMF to help them. This is a big change in IMF reform. And third, to tackle this debt. Because if we don't have another way to deal with the high debt situations, most of their taxation effort will be used to pay the debt or to be sent to illicit flows to rich countries.
Thank you. And the summit you were referring to is the Agricultural and Seed Summit that has taken place in Nairobi at the invitation of President Ruto. He is one of the presidents that's very involved in global and multilateral affairs, a little bit of an exception in the African context, but a very important reference point. And briefly,
shortly to your question about why it's difficult to get support from the Global South for Ukraine. I think it's very important what narrative you use for once. When we took the first sanction, I was part of the decisions of the first 6 or 7 sanction decisions in EU. Joseph Borrell said, we have not reached out to Global South. And then we more or less did like you do in in the civil society. Each foreign minister got 6 or 7 Global South foreign ministers, and we called them and said, hey, you need to support us in this, and you need to vote in United Nations for this resolution. And what we could see was, one, if we say that this is against Russia, more or less, no. They did not want to go against Russia at all, more or less, most of them. 2, if we said this is about territorial integrity, this is about the rule that one country cannot by force take another part of another country's territory, then we got support. And that was the argument we need to use. Not Russia is a terrible country, but if you don't keep up the international rules for territorial integrity, you could be next. And the second thing is that we should be aware that Russian diplomacy in getting their narrative is huge. I was in Jordania with 12 Arab countries a month ago, and more or less all of them, it was like 20 parties, progressive parties. This was the Social Democratic Arabic Forum as part of the Progressive Alliance. Nearly all of them had bought the narrative from Russia that Ukraine is not a sovereign country. So you cannot take any part of it because it was never a sovereign country. And that is bullshit. You know, we have even a big exhibition in Sweden now, starting with the marriage 1019 of the Swedish princess Ingeborg with the Prince of Kiev, and ongoing from there. So I had to tell them that this is just you being fooled by Russia. And we got a discussion about this because they really believed that Ukraine has never been a sovereign state. And then the international rule is not applying. And we don't understand that we have to have forceful diplomatic action to counter the Russian diplomatic narrative in Global South.
Thank you very much. I think it's important to recognize as well that, especially for progressive governments, be that Africa or Latin America, there's still a collective memory of the fact that the Soviet Union supported against colonial oppression, and also during the military dictatorships in Latin America, they were by and large supported by the United States. So it might not be...
Yeah, but narrative is, like in South Africa, I was the only Western guest at ANC last Congress. And what they said, 4,200 delegates, was that we defeated the apartheid system because Soviet Union helped us. The Nordic countries gave more, but they didn't recognize it because we haven't bragged about this, what we did. So now the narrative among the young generation in ANC South Africa was they helped us, West didn't, and that's a wrong narrative.
Yeah, that's a kind of a reframing of what has happened from the perspective of the BRICS. I'll put you on hold for a second because I want to get two more interventions in. One was over here, the other one was with this gentleman over here. Please be brief, and your questions can only be directed to either Diego or Neva, because I'm going to give the two of them the last word today in this.
Okay, thanks very much. Jeremy Cliff, and you can direct them as you see fit. A quick provocation, if I may, and thanks for the excellent points. I think it's been a really strong panel. I mean, I think as progressives, we are instinctively multilateralists. We vest our greatest hopes in universal multilateral institutions like the UN, like the Bretton Woods bodies. But as has come across, I think, already, those bodies are not in a good shape. The Security Council is deadlocked. I think the hopes in the Summit of the Future, I hope I'm wrong, but seem to be pretty modest from what I'm hearing. UN peacekeepers are pulling out of arenas like the Sahel, the DRC, and then you go to Washington and you have institutions that just don't have the firepower needed to confront the crises. I mean, the World Bank's capitalization now is about 1/5 what it was in the 1960s as a share of global GDP. And then you look at where the real ambition and the dynamism is coming from, and it's actually on climate, it's minilateralist bodies like the Bridgetown Initiative or the Climate Vulnerable Forum. On geopolitics and economic governance, it's things like the G20 or the BRICS. If there's going to be a peace in the Middle East, it looks much more likely to come from a regional coalition than from the UN. So as multilateralists, and this is my question, should we be actually tipping the balance, as it were, of our hopes towards minilateralism and smaller coalitions of the willing, and away from these universal institutions that are sadly struggling?
Thank you very much. This is going to be for Diego. And the gentleman over here, please.
Yeah, it's working, yes. The gentleman here, his name is Conny Reuter. I spent a lot of time of my life in Brussels, so Berlin is where I'm living now, and I worked with Maria on a project from Progressive Alliance on a new inclusive multilateralism. My question to Neva, we know each other for many years also, there was a question of multilateralism and multilateralists. What can we do to bring much more internationalism also to our political parties, political families, and to civil society, and to get out of the trap that this is a discussion only for specialized, motivated, and enlightened people, but really breaking it down at the general agenda. I very much like the point you make on the necessity to work with smaller countries. And as we are here in Berlin, may I remind that we had last week the visit of President Boric from Chile. And Boric made the difference because he's very clear on Ukraine, and he can be also very clear on Ukraine, because Russia did not do anything in 1973, although they knew that there was a military coup coming up. So I think there are chances also that we can go through with the principles that Anne was laying out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Neva, you have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Connie, we can have coffee later for a longer discussion. I mean, it's difficult maybe for Slovenia. For Slovenia, maybe not so difficult because of our past when we were still part of Yugoslavia and along the line. And I think maybe this is something that we have in our DNA somehow. But time have changed, of course. For us, internationalism in our parties, unfortunately, is slipping away for some of us. I know that Sweden has a great history and is still part of engagement in Middle East and in Africa and so on. In Slovenia, I think we are still trying to find ourselves, how to cooperate further. And I would encourage, of course, all of the political parties, because it's, I mean, these are the challenges. Giacomo spoke about this on his first day here in Berlin. There are challenges we are facing that we can only, recover from together. It's not going to be a solution, Slovenian Social Democrats, Swedish Social Democrats, and so on. It's going to be, solution together, us as a progressives in the world.
Thank you very much. Diego, multilateralism of the willing on a smaller scale as a transition strategy?
Well, basically, whatever works. So I think, yes, I mean, we have, I spoke about the European Union, so that's sort of very deep minilateralism, but we should work through the full scale of options. So yes, but minilateralism, of course, it works, especially when there's when the overall system is not working. And there was also a cultural reform of the UN.
Yes.
Very briefly, but I would just say that I don't know about the UN, but I'm quite certain that we need a cultural reform of the West, collective West. We are less and less convinced of our principles, so we are not convincing because we are not convinced. And we tend to preach ever more, so we should preach less and act more convincingly.
Thank you very much. We are right on time. It's 1 minute over. You will all become honorary Germans for your punctuality. Thank you so much for an entertaining and interesting panel, and please join me in thanking our speakers.
Yes, thank you so much. And so it's 11:15, so we have arrived at the coffee break. We will meet again at 11:30, and a quick heads up what's approaching next. So here at the main stage, there will be a session, Paths to Enlargement, a democratic and capable European Union in a changing geopolitical landscape. This session will be also organized by the Foundation for European Progressive Studies and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung Foundation. Then a forum on the right, a matter of fact, building democratic resilience against climate disinformation. This is hosted by the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and the boardroom in the first floor by invitation only. From concept to campaign, progressive security as an election strategy winner with a question mark. So interesting. So, and it's designed with global progress action. So see you again at 11:30.